In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Christ is in our midst. A surgeon, an engineer, and a politician were debating which of their professions was the oldest. The surgeon said, Eve was made from Adam's rib. And that, of course, was a surgical procedure. Obviously, surgery is the oldest profession. The engineer countered with, yes, but before that, order was created out of the chaos. And that most certainly was an engineering job. The politician smiled and said triumphantly, aha, and who do you think created the chaos? Many times in our life we create chaos not because we're Christians, but sometimes because we try to be, quote unquote, politically correct. And many times in our Christian lives, we cannot juggle the two of those things. We try to say something to ease the message of God, to try to walk on both sides of the fence and not take a stand. And we try to do what is politically correct instead of what is spiritually correct. How many times in your life have you thought about correcting another person, not out of the spirit of condemnation or of righteousness, but just out of love? We tend to do that for our children, but our children really don't understand it until they're older and look back and maybe have seen pitfalls that they've been steered out of from their parents. But many times they look back on their life and say, well, my parents were hard on me, but I turned out okay. So we don't really feel restricted to tell our own children what is maybe a pitfall for them or what we have learned in our life that might avoid a path of destruction for them or a path of need and suffering. However, when it comes to our Christian lives, how many of us are too ashamed or embarrassed or don't feel guarded enough either intellectually or spiritually to stand up and say what is right and what is wrong? Not just politically, because that is just the mere tip of the iceberg, but more so ethically. What is happening in our country, what is happening in our families, and what is happening in our workplace. You have to ask yourself a question. And I know I pose a lot of questions to you in my sermons, but do you do what is best for God's will? Not for your will, but for God's will. If you think about God's will and how it plays into your life, Christ was not a political man. He was not a man who came to the earth to win the hearts of the higher-ups, to win the heart of Caesar, to win the heart of anyone except for them to win the heart of God. And you see in his teachings that he makes that division between secular life and Christian life and a godly life. Now that's not to say that the world is evil and we should stay away from everything and we shouldn't touch anything and we should stay in our houses with icons all around us and never go outside. Because Christ went out and he taught to all those around him, and he showed them that there's a different way, not the way of riding an issue from one person to the next. And we see that riding of an issue from the time when we're a child. We see it from little kids who will go in one circle of friends and they'll talk about somebody else in the other circle of friends, and then later they'll switch to that circle of friends and talk about the people in the other circle. And what do we do as adults? We don't stand there in the circle of friends. We use our cell phones to do the same exact thing. We talk about other people and we flip-flop, as we've heard so many times in the elections. We flip-flop on issues. And the unfortunate thing is, if God were to take us right now and we had just went one particular way on an issue or thought one particular thing about the church or our family members, He grabs us right where we're at. Not where we hope to be, but right where we are. And not right where we were either. That's the other problem. Some people say, well, I gave to Katrina and I gave, $200 for the hurricane disaster, and God will look at that and He's going to say, okay, That'll be my ticket because I helped someone who was needy. But what are you doing right now? That's the question. You can't rest on the laurels of the past. And how many times, if you think about that, in your families, have you been frustrated with a family member who just lists their accolades in life and uses that as their resume to teach you, to show you that they are the best? But yet, when we look at our Christian lives, that's all we do, is recall our accolades. We do that not only with our family and our friends, but we would do that with God too. That's why confession is the least used sacrament in the church, because everyone really feels that they're justified in what they're doing. Not absolutely everybody, but a majority feel that I can list my accolades. I have made a resume of my goodness. And God knows my weak points, but why do I need to get rid of that when I tell Him on my own? Again, we pick and choose. We ride that fence. We're those politically correct Christians, and we're not true Christians. You cannot be politically correct on moral issues that are facing our society in these days without defying your Christianity. There's no way. When it comes to misguided sexuality, when it comes to euthanasia, when it comes to abortion, when it comes to all these major issues that we see in our society, we can't just flip-flop or do what we feel is best. Or to be politically correct, to give another person the opportunity and say, well, we shouldn't really interfere in what somebody else thinks because that's their opinion. Was that Christ's mission? Is that what He did? Did He come to earth and say, I'm really not going to interfere and teach you anything because I don't want to bother you? Well, it seems like we pick and choose as Christians not only how we're going to address an issue, but who we're going to address it with and who we're going to bother. Are we going to bother somebody with teaching the mission of God and telling them about the church? Or are we going to bother somebody and really list their faults as we do so many times? That's why the church teaches us about judgment. And right before we go into the Lenten period is Judgment Sunday, when we look and we hear about Christ being the judge and don't judge or you will be judged. But yet we tend to do that so much more than we say the good things in another person. To look at a person maybe sitting next to you or behind you in the church and look at them and say, what is the good in that person? What are the good things that just looking at them that I can see? And the first thing you should say is that they're here. They're here putting themselves in the presence of God. But if you look at our wills and God's will, and you think of the life of the Virgin Mary, what did she do? She said, your will be done. Whatever you want, Lord, I submit myself to you. She didn't say, this is really going to ruin my marriage. This is really going to ruin my house. If she could see forward and thought about seeing her son crucified, her only son crucified, and to say, I really don't want to see my child killed in front of me. I really don't want to have to live the rest of my life with one of the people that he taught, one of the disciples, John. I don't want to have to spend my days with him growing old. Did she say that? Not at all. She said, I submit myself to the will of God. And what was her reward? It wasn't a big house. It wasn't a fancy car. It wasn't a lot of children or social status. But her body is not here on this earth because it was taken to heaven when she had passed away. That is the true claim, that Christ claims those and takes those and blesses those who follow what His will is. Not those who ride the fence of their Christianity, but those who take a stand. The other day, or probably a week or so ago, I had did a baptism for a little baby, and the name was Xenophon. And you probably don't know a lot about Saint Xenophon, but it's an interesting story, and I want to share it with you because he had two sons, and he was very wealthy. And he sent his sons away to become lawyers, to learn the law of the town so that they could have a wealthy life as well. So he sent his sons away to college. Now, most of you would be cringing if you heard this story and thought about your children in college. He sent his sons away to the college, and he didn't hear from them. And sometimes that happens to us too as parents and for other reasons. But the reason he didn't hear from his kids was because they took the money that their father had given them, they gave it away to the poor, and they went into a monastery. They went to study the church instead of studying law. And St. Xenophon had gone out to find his boys. And as he went out to find his boys, he found out that they had given the money away and went into the monastery. And then he himself and his wife dedicated themselves to a monastic life at the end because they saw what their children had chosen. But that's the fork in the road for his children. But each and every day, it seems that we have a new fork in the road. We have all these spider veins of which way to go in life. We might come to big decisions where it might say, we either choose God or we choose evil. But a lot of times, you don't see in an airplane, especially, or if you've ever been on an airplane, if the pilot is really trying to get somewhere fast, you'll feel the plane go to the side really quick or slow down. It feels like you're stopping right in midair. But for a good pilot, it's almost like a limousine ride. You don't feel it. You just feel slight turns. You feel the plane slow down. When you land, it doesn't sound like you took out 15 houses on the way down. It's a nice, smooth ride. Likewise, in our life as Christians, the choices that come to us in our life are very small, and they're minor changes. But if you keep changing in one direction, you end up going a complete and different direction from where you intended. And that's the devil's real clutch on us. He can make you do one thing 1 degree different each and every day until you are in a direction that you come to the church, and as I've heard so many times, Father, I'm empty. I don't know how I got like this. You know why we don't know? Because it happens so subtly each and every day. The trick is we have to be alert and awake and know that this is happening to us and to see it and to identify the evil that is coming at us each and every day so that we can make the right decisions. Because God sees us and He is always looking at us. He sees us in our pain, in our suffering. But many times if we're not suffering, if we're not in pain, if we're not plagued by a decision, we make that decision and we walk right past God and we don't even think twice about it because we feel justified. And today in the gospel reading we hear a beautiful story about Christ seeing someone in pain and helping them out without even asking. And we see the woman, it's a beautiful story today in the gospel reading of a woman who was a widow and her only son had died at a young age. Now, in those days, if you were a widow, not only was your lifestyle threatened, but if you lost your son, who was the provider, then you were even in deeper trouble. And Christ saw this woman crying, walking behind a casket, and without even saying anything, He sees her, He has pity on her, and raises her son. He goes up and just touches. And in those days, a casket was not like what we see a casket to be with the lid and the seals and all those. It was just a flat piece of wood, and they would lay the body on there. And they would go through their funeral procession through the street. So He goes and just touches the boy and says, "Arise." Now, whose gift was that? Was it the boy's? In one way, yes. But the greater gift was to the mother. Because she was the one who was suffering and knew, and Christ saw her and knew that her life was to be devastated with the loss of her son. Christ knows that without His presence in our lives are devastation. Our lives are desolate, they're empty. But many times, like I said before, we just ride the fence. We walk the fence. We say, it's okay to be misguided. It's okay for this. It's okay if I swear. It's okay if I yell at my kids or whatever and don't spend time with them because I have better things to do. Or I understand, or I have to be tolerant to everything in the world. Toleration is Christian devastation. If you tolerate everything that's going on around you and all the deception that the devil continually sends to us, then you are destroying yourself spiritually. So the question is, are you doing what's best for your will, or are you doing what's best for God's will? Don't ride the fence. Don't be politically correct. Be spiritually correct. Amen.